Welcome to the Writer Talks. If you remember, I started my previous video with these lines. Don't you think that of all the puzzling and formidable things that we encounter, none can match the wondrous intrigue of the human mind? I'm going to ask you that again in the wake of yet another tragic incident that unfolded in Kerala. The case of this young, brilliant 24-year-old brutalized by her husband. Yet another dowry-driven horror. I wonder at the euphemisms under which it is doled out. Gifts, presents, tokens, that masks the fact that the other person is seeking inducements to marry, operating with a sense of entitlement. This is perhaps the biggest red flag in abuse. Feeling of entitlement. And abuse, as we all know, extends to being physical, emotional, verbal, all of which are equally subversive and soul-crushing. My guest today, Kerriann Ostland from US, in her debut novel Good Enough, based on true events, discusses the perils and harm of emotional abuse in a toxic relationship. Writing has always been a passion for Kerriann. Since the age of 7, Kerriann has not only been an avid reader, but also an avid writer, and she has enjoyed creating her own stories. Kerriann's dream of becoming an author came true in 2018 of May with the publication of Good Enough based on true events. She has since gone on to speak at many public speaking events and continues to foster her growth as an author. Kerriann has a master's in social work and was selected to speak at the National Association of Social Workers Massachusetts chapter annual symposium about this prevalent topic to bring in more awareness about this rising issue. Her commitment to repeatedly addressing this issue stems from her need to demonstrate to others that they are not alone and that there is hope. Kerriann's second novel, Signed with Love, is based on her real-life adoption experiences that Kerriann hopes will go on to bring in awareness to the complications, joys, and hardships of adoption. While she is not kickboxing or dancing, she is doing yoga or reading. Let's dive in and listen to Kerriann's inspiring journey as a writer with a deep social commitment. But before that, please continue to like, share, and subscribe to the Writer Talk so that we can continue such rewarding literary engagements with brilliant writers from across the world. I do hope you enjoy watching me talk to this cherubic, committed writer, Kerriann Ostland. Do write in your comments in the comment section. Until next week, stay strong. Love yourself, and remember that abuse is not acceptable. Ahoy! Welcome to the Writer Talks. Joining me all the way from Massachusetts is Kerriann Ostland. Ahoy, Kerriann! Welcome to the Writer Talks.
Hi, thank you for having me.
It's a pleasure, absolute pleasure. So, how are you doing, and how has the week been for you?
I'm doing pretty good. The week has been good so far. We're starting to get into warm weather over here, so we're kind of out of our gloomy, rainy time and are more into days that are in the 70s and 80s with lots of sunshine. So can't complain. So I've just been trying to take opportunities to enjoy being outside whenever I can, and so it's been a pretty laid-back week so far.
Lovely, lovely. Now, you told me previously that you're in the process of editing your second novel, Signed with Love, right? How's that coming along, and are you through with your editing, or are you still battling yourself?
I'm still battling it, yeah. I'm probably about halfway through my first read-through of it. I have already found some plot gaps, so I am in the process of finding out are there any more, and then going back and having to rewrite some parts. So it's still a little bit of a ways away before it will be published, but I'm hopefully by early 2022 it will be out. But yeah, I'm definitely in the throes of it right now.
Right. So it's roughly about a year from now, is it? Or less than that, a little less than that.
Yeah, hopefully less than that. It might be a little bit more, but I hope not.
Is that going to be self-published, or do you have a publisher working with you?
It will be self-published, most likely. The longer that I've been in the writing world, the more that I am learning about, different networking opportunities, different writing contests that are going on. So I'm trying to get more involved in that, because that seems to be what sort of gets my name more out there and can attract publishers. But right now, I don't know, I'm kind of an impatient person, so I'm more along the lines of like, I just want to get my story out, and then whatever comes afterward will come afterward. So
absolutely. So, what kind of a writer are you? The one who waits for inspiration and muse to hit, or are you one of those people who sits and writes every day, no matter what?
I want to say I more write when inspiration strikes. I've tried to be more structured with my writing, because the current novel that I'm in the process of editing, it's over 500 pages, and it took me about 2 years to write. But it's tough because I work as an outpatient therapist, so oftentimes I work odd hours, so I've had to mainly limit my writing to the weekends. But I try to set aside structured time to do that. I try to be more disciplined with it. And then I also do try to journal at least every day or every other day, just to at least kind of keep my thoughts flowing.
It's lovely. Could you share with us as to what Signed with Love is all about?
So Signed with Love it's a work of fiction, but it's actually largely based on my adoption story. So I was living with my adoptive parents when I was 5 months old and was legally adopted when I was 3. Didn't know too much about my origins, and then about 4 years ago, a biological half-sister had managed to find me on Facebook. So we started corresponding, and I learned a lot more about my history that I hadn't really realized. Like, I learned that, I grew up an only child, and I found out that I am actually one of 4 daughters. So that was like a really big shock. But then just hearing more about my biological mother's story, part of the reason that I ended up being placed for adoption was because she was in a domestic violence situation. And so finding that out, it was really jarring. I went through a period of time of feeling like my identity was really compromised, not really knowing who I was anymore. And I got over that with time and, was able to find healing through therapy and things like that. And then once I was able to heal, I was able to come to the terms with the fact that, I do have siblings. I did want to connect with them. And I just realized that, in talking with different people, whether it was work colleagues, whether it was friends, there was just a lot of misconceptions about adoption or about all of the complicated factors that you kind of have to take in when you're communicating with biological family. And so I decided to write that in a fictional account of my story. So it's told from 3 perspectives. It's told from my biological mother's perspective, my half-sister who found me, and then me. So it alternates between those points of views and talks about how these stories interconnect and eventually come together, but it touches on a lot of the themes that come along with being adopted, or finding out that you have a sibling who's adopted, or you're making the choice to have your child put up for adoption. So that is the work.
That's lovely, and sounds very interesting, and especially given the fact that it's going to be multiple perspectives. That's fantastic.
Yeah, definitely. I'm excited.
Now, I came across this very interesting passage on your website where you have opted to quote Franz Kafka: "A non-writing writer is a monster quoting insanity." Absolutely perfect. But tell me why or what impelled you to include this in your website?
I think what compelled me to put that on my website is because I just feel like it speaks so truthfully to the writing experience, at least for me. Like, I don't know, I feel like I can't really tame the monster unless I'm writing, and I feel that sometimes the best forms of healing come from writing. And yeah, so I just really loved that quote and felt that kind of speaks to my experiences, because a lot of my writing that I've written mainly to heal myself, but also in hopes that I can heal other people too with my stories.
Fair enough. And, writing always comes with this huge amount of responsibility as well. It's not merely entertainment.
Yeah, exactly. Very true.
We will continue talking, but first let's dive into the rapid response section. I'm hoping you're familiar with the rapid response section.
Yes.
Great. So I'm posing a set of questions with options, and you will have to choose one of the options without deliberating too much on it, all right?
Okay, sounds good.
Great. Now, since you're from Massachusetts, I thought of including this particular question. Now, between Massachusetts and Mississippi, which is the one that is harder to spell?
Oh gosh. Well, I remember in elementary school, we had a first grade teacher who came up with like a cute little rhyme, so we would remember how to spell Mississippi. So, but I would say if you did not learn that poem, I would say Mississippi is probably harder than Massachusetts, if I had to guess.
All right. Okay. Now, between your book being a bestseller or being a winner of the Booker Prize, if you had the option, which one would you choose?
That's a tough. Well, I guess I would say I would probably actually have to go with that one then, the winning that prize, because when I think bestseller, I more think in terms of sales. And for me, I find it really hard to even market myself, and I care less about the money and more about the message. So I think I would much rather prefer a prize that, you know, is more centered towards actually focusing on my writing and the quality of my work than a bestseller that maybe focuses more on the amount of books that I've sold.
Right, fair enough. That's so well put, actually. Between writing socially relevant fiction or being a minister in charge of social welfare, let's say, what would you opt to do?
Oh gosh, this is tough too because I'm a social worker by trade, so I do a lot.
That's exactly why I included it.
I don't know. I mean, I think if I had the choice, I think I would say, you know, being a writer and creating social change that way, I think would probably be what I would prefer, because I think it's a little bit more indirect. Like, as somebody who, you know, is a social worker and I work in the social justice field, it's very time consuming. It can be very frustrating. Whereas, you know, with your writing, you're sort of more writing for yourself, hoping that you will make a message for other people and hoping that you can elicit change in some way. And so I think it would probably feel less stressful if I just focused on, you know, writing and hoping to create change that way versus, you know, taking a more active role. I think that's kind of how I would prefer it, to be more on the back of that.
All right. Now, between reading, writing, and kickboxing, if you were to do any one of these three things for the rest of your life, which one would you choose and why?
Oh gosh. Yeah, that's a tough one too, because I like to read a lot as well. I think I would have to say, if I could just pick one, I probably would pick writing. And I think the reason why is just because I get so much out of it personally for myself. And I know that it also is really, you know, empowering when somebody says, I read your work, or I listened to your story and it resonated with me. This is my experience. With my novel Good Enough, I do a lot of speaking engagements, or at least I had been before COVID, and every engagement that I did, at least somebody would come up to say, you know, my mom was in an abusive relationship, or I was in an abusive relationship. Thank you for sharing your story. And so I think with writing, I kind of get both sides of it. I feel, you know, the empowerment from having shared my story and feeling good about it. And then I also feel empowered by hearing other people having read it and that my work made an impact.
Right. Absolutely. Now, between meeting Franz Kafka, Albert Camus, and Hemingway, Right. So Kafka, Camus, and Hemingway, if you had the option to meet any one of these three literary giants, whom would you choose to meet, and what is that one thing that you would ask?
Oh gosh. I would probably have to go with Hemingway because I feel like he always writes these very long novels that he puts a lot of time and effort into. And I mean, I can't even imagine like the amount of time that it took him to write Moby Dick, honestly. Especially before the age of technology and everything like that. And I feel like one question that I would probably pose to him is, what kept you going? What kept you motivated to to keep writing, especially a long story like that? That's probably what I would say.
Great. Okay. Now, on a lighter note, if you had to choose any one of these three popular food between pizzas, hamburgers, and sausages, which one would you choose? Which is your preferred food?
For me, it's definitely pizza because there's a wide variety of toppings, and I go back and forth between favorite toppings for pizzas, so I always like that. I can always mix it up.
Absolutely, I would totally agree with you. Pizzas anytime eat, right?
Yeah, exactly.
Okay, the last question now. If you were heading the United Nations, and presently, right now, if you were heading the United Nations, and what would the first issue be that you would address? What is that one issue that is facing the world, and you would address it first?
I think that if I was head of the United Nations, I think I would want to address racial inequality that we have just across the world, really. I think with the murder of George Floyd that happened, over a year ago now, it created outrage across the world, and I think oftentimes, at least, for myself, like we kind of focus so much on our own country and what's going on, and it blew my mind to see that these racial inequalities happen in Europe and Asia and all these other places, and to, almost the same degree, if not, a worse degree than where the United States is. And I just feel like we need to somehow bridge those sorts of racial divides, and I think that's the only way that we can grow as a people, is if we learn to somehow be more inclusive or accepting of all other people. So I think that would probably be what I would want to address if I was head of the United Nations.
Fair enough. Thank you for being such a sport.
Oh no, of course.
Continuing with talking about your writing process, I gather that you've been an avid reader and writer ever since your childhood, and you've always engaged with these two activities, reading and writing. Now, when did you start writing actually, and what was the motivation behind it?
Yeah, so I feel like I honestly started writing from like the time that I learned how to write. So I grew up I think I mentioned earlier, I grew up an only child, so I really didn't have much to entertain myself other than my own imagination. So I was constantly making up stories in my head. I sort of always had this running narrative. And, I remember being, like 6 or 7 years old and writing short little storybooks about, favorite characters from TV shows or something like that, or favorite, Disney princesses. And, I think what drew me to writing is my parents read to me every night as a kid growing up. So I had that experience of loving to hear other stories. And it must have been my parents, I don't remember, but I think somebody said, if you really like reading that much, you could write your own story. And that was sort of what motivated me. And I think, around the time I really got into writing was in first grade, and I remember my first grade teacher reading us Harry Potter. Harry Potter had just come out, so that was like a special treat that she read to us, and so she always encouraged us to read and to write, and so I think that was kind of also a driving factor in what caused me to start writing, and I've been writing ever since.
Lovely, lovely. Now, I think I read that your first multi-chapter book was illustrated by your friend, and which eventually led you to promise yourself that one day you will have a novel published in your name. So, could you tell us more about this experience? It sounds rather interesting.
Yeah, it's so funny. Yeah, so I think I was in probably about second grade, and one of my friends had like this little doll that was like very unique looking. It was like one of the Barbie dolls that you see, but like one of the little kid versions of it. And she kind of looked like an elf or something like that. I don't quite remember, but something about her, for whatever reason, we kind of were like, we should make a story about her. And I remember like the story was called The Princess's Crown. I don't remember any other details than that, although I am sure it is buried in my parents' house somewhere. But yeah, I remember I was the one who came up with the story. My friend helped with some of the plot, and then she was the one who illustrated. She was a very talented drawer even back then. So yeah, we put this together just on like, lined notebook paper. I think it was only like 10 pages or something like that. But that was kind of the start of it. It was maybe like 5 chapters or something. And that was what started it. And so then, yeah, when I was in 5th grade, I wrote like my first chapter book that covered 3 notebooks. So it was, approximately like 120 something pages. And then it just kept on steamrolling from there. So yeah, I still can't even think of like what made us think like this would be a good idea to write the book, but that was definitely the catalyst to, wow, that actually wasn't so bad and that was a lot of fun. I want to keep doing this.
That's lovely. So it gave you the fillip, it gave you the impetus to continue writing.
Exactly, yeah.
Well, congratulations on the very well received debut novel that you published, Good Enough. And I believe it was published in 2018, and ever since you've had multiple opportunities to speak in public about mental health and abuse and relationships. Can you speak more about how you conceived this novel and how long it took for you to write this?
Sure. So this novel was written actually as a healing story. So I had been in an emotionally abusive relationship since I was about 17 years old. And I did not know at the time that it was abusive in any way. I very much felt that whatever he said to me, I felt that I was deserving of whatever it was that he was berating me for. I had multiple friends tell me that they didn't think this relationship was healthy, and I was so manipulated by that point that my take on it was, you just don't understand. He had sort of manipulated me into saying, I'm doing all of this because I love you and I care about you. And so when friends would say, we don't think this relationship is healthy, I was sort of like, well, you guys just don't get it. And so when I was finally out of the relationship, I originally had been thinking that my ex and I, we were very like on again, off again. Sometimes he would say we were a couple, sometimes he wouldn't. And I remember originally thinking like, we're going to have our happily ever after, and I'm going to write a story talking about our happily ever after. And naturally that didn't happen, and I realized how abusive it was. And so I decided to actually start writing the story for my own sense of healing. And then as I went on and was remembering things from like very early on, back when I was in high school. I was writing this when I was in my early 20s at the time. I started seeing patterns that I hadn't seen in the moment and thinking to myself, like, I can't believe I didn't see this. And I just realized, like, if this happened to me, this is probably happening to other people. And so I talked to a lot of friends about it, and I said, I'm thinking of using this story not just as like a healing tool for me, but I'm actually thinking of sharing this story. And a lot of my friends said, I think that would be a great idea. And it was really terrifying when I wrote it, when I finally came out with it, because I was so afraid that people were going to read this story and they were going to turn around and say, he was right the whole time, she is the crazy one. And so that was really scary. And there was a couple of times where I was like, I don't even know if I want to publish this. I'm really afraid. but I ultimately decided to do it anyway, and it's been overwhelmingly positive and just very validating to have people be able to read it and say, yeah, like this was not a healthy relationship, and thank you for sharing. So that's sort of the story as behind what motivated me to write it and what inspired me to move forward with publishing it.
That's so very relevant. And in fact, continuing from what you said, despite all the awareness that we have and having read and heard so much about abuse in relationships, so the best of us, despite all this knowing, there is either a sense of denial or a lack of understanding that this is what is actually happening with you. Why do you think that happens?
Yeah, it's kind of funny you asked this question because I actually just spoke at a symposium back in April where I actually presented on media and how it sort of impacts the way teenagers see a lot of abuse, see relationships, and how a lot of these relationships are depicted on different TV shows and things like that. Because, how I see it is, I think that, especially when it comes to emotional abuse anyway, like I always think about the domestic violence pamphlets that are available at any doctor's office, school counseling center, wherever it might be, where they're kind of like, if your partner checks off, all of these boxes, then they're most likely emotionally abusive. And what I've found is that a lot of times, if somebody is truly emotionally abusive, they're not always going to fit into those boxes because they're kind of master manipulators when somebody is emotionally abusive. So they're going to specifically hone in on your weaknesses or the things that you don't like about yourself, and it might not necessarily check off one of those boxes that you see on the pamphlet. So I think that plays a part in it. And then I know for myself, as I was writing the story, I thought a lot about the TV shows that I was watching during that time. And Gossip Girl was a really big show during that time. And one of their biggest couples was very, very unhealthy relationship. And to this day, I see articles saying, they're one of the most iconic TV couples of all time. And I remember watching it as a teenager thinking like, I love this relationship. I want to be them. I got wrapped up in the drama. And when you're a teenager, like you kind of think like, this is what real life is. Your brain hasn't developed yet. You don't really understand how the world works. And so when I was going through a lot of the same situations with my ex at the time, boyfriend at the time, I was kind of just like, well, this is what I'm seeing on TV. So clearly, like, we're just acting out kind of like our own drama. And so I think like that plays a huge role. I think that a lot of times, there are lots of teen shows now that I watch that I kind of think like, wow, like they're focusing so much on the drama, but they're not bringing awareness to this being unhealthy, because even with the unhealthy relationships that are so often glamorized in the media, you don't even have a friend in the TV show saying, we don't think this relationship is healthy. Like you have characters that are almost kind of praising these relationships. And so that almost kind of reinforces this idea that it's okay to be treated poorly. So I think like that, I think it's a mix of a whole bunch of different things, but I do feel how we depict relationships, how we, kind of glamorize this idea of all of the drama that comes with cheating and stuff like that. I think that does play an impact on people maybe not really understanding how dangerous it can be and how quickly it can escalate and become a problem.
Fair enough. I think one of the other troubling aspects that you brought in good enough was the parental abuse, the emotional parental abuse, especially from Lisa's mom, the principal character Lisa's mom, who is passive aggressive. And it came quite as a surprise to me for somebody like me from India, with all the talk that goes about mental health in a country like America, that these set of parents were averse to seeking help and were averse to the fact that Lisa needed help. Would you like to talk about that?
Yeah, I mean, I think that it's really funny. I do feel that the United States has made some really great strides with mental health, but then there's also a lot of areas where I feel like we are still steps behind. There's still a lot of stigma around mental health. There's still a lot of stigma around being on medications, especially depending on the brand of medication that you're on. Because I know that, personally in my work, I see clients who are, potentially on antipsychotics, but they're maybe on it for sleep issues, but people see they're on an antipsychotic and then they kind of get this label of like, oh, they're crazy. So there's still a lot of stigma that exists. And I think especially, and I'm not trying to be stereotypical when I say that, but I do find that older generations here in the United States have most of that stigma around mental health. It's sort of this idea of like, you have to pull yourself up by your bootstraps. This is just life is tough. Or it's this idea that like, we don't air our dirty laundry to people we don't know. Whatever family secrets we have stay within the family. So there's a lot of secrecy and a lot of hiding. And I think that at the root of it all, I think that it really comes down to, people's shame around, if my child is in therapy, then that reflects poorly on me as a parent. And most of the time, sometimes that's the case. Most of the time it's not. But I think a lot of times we have the stigma because we are concerned about how it reflects on us. And I think that's a large reason as to why it continues to be such a big issue even now.
Absolutely. I think this whole idea of public image, it's almost like people value that far more than their own emotional well-being, sadly.
Yeah, it is really sad.
I particularly love the realism that you have infused into Good Enough, and the ordinariness of the characters. And I mean this as a compliment. The ordinariness of the characters adds to its credibility. Like Lisa is so very vulnerable, and she's a perfect counterpoint to this really manipulative and deceptive Tegan. And it's fast paced. There's a lot of emphasis on action, and it immediately draws the reader into the sufferings of Lisa as soon as you start reading it. What do you think are particularly your strengths as a writer?
I think that my strengths as a writer is that I am very honest. Like, when I was writing Good Enough, there was a lot of fear that I had of like, is this too raw? Is this gonna, is this too much? Should I reel it in? But the way that I see it is that we can't really make any real change if we just sort of skirt over the surface of something that is much deeper and needs a lot more attention. And so I wanted to try to be as honest as I could. And I think that that's a strength, that, I'm not afraid to tell the truth and to talk about all sides of a particularly difficult situation. And I think that, I'm also very determined. Like, when I set my mind, like, okay, I want to write this story, I follow through and I do it. Granted, it might take longer than I was anticipating it was going to, but I always see it through to the end. And, if I believe in something enough, or I'm passionate about something enough, then I'm always going to see it through. And I think that, I've really found writing as a vessel for that. And so I think that's another strength that I have, is that passion to the amount of change that you can make from your story.
Right. Now, what was harder for you? Was it editing or promoting the book, given the fact that it was self-published?
Yeah, I would definitely say it's always going to be promoting for me when it comes to that. Because I'm more about forming relationships with people. So again, like anything to do with trying to figure out sales, pricing, numbers, where to put my name out there, like those are all like foreign things to me. Like, I remember when I published my website, I was able to, talk with somebody who kind of talked me through, like, these are the certain things that you should have available on your website, and thinking like, wow, I never would have even thought of that. And it's still a learning curve even now. Like, I try to be on Twitter every day. If I post anything on Facebook, I try to, promote it and, pay money so that it reaches larger audiences. But it's not easy, and it's something that I still struggle with day to day, and I feel like I'm constantly trying to find, different opportunities to try to get my name out there. So an opportunity like this to be on a YouTube show, I was like, I'm going to do it because it's going to reach more people, and that's what I need. So,
Absolutely true. And this is something that I've commonly heard from writers. And I think, with that creative bent of mind, economics doesn't entirely fit into that. And it's harder to learn.
Absolutely. Yeah. And it's still a learning curve even now.
Very true. Very true. Now, given the multiple opportunities you've had to give talks and conduct perhaps symposiums around mental health and abuse in relationships, what has there been a particularly memorable moment or a feedback or a compliment that has stayed with you?
Yeah. So I think one of the most memorable was when I was first trying to just branch out and just bring awareness to, emotional abuse. That was something that I felt very passionately about, that I wanted to try to target younger people. So one of the things that I did was I reached out to an old health teacher that I had had in middle school, just saying, hey, like, would you be interested in me coming and giving a talk? And I said, I could just come to each of your classes. We could do an assembly. And we decided to do an assembly, and it got approved. And I think what made that so memorable is that was my first time speaking in public about it, really afraid about how people would react. Especially they were middle schoolers, they were 8th graders, so I was very nervous about that.
Volatile age group.
Yeah, exactly. But I was really shocked at everybody's attentiveness, and kids asked like really, really powerful questions, like really deep questions that I would not have anticipated. And there were a couple times that like I would say something that, like at one point I brought up my ex used to call me a slut, and like all the 8th graders were like, oh, like, and so it took a while for them to settle down. And I remember thinking like, oh my gosh, I think I've lost them. But I didn't, and if anything, it seemed to draw them in more. So yeah, I had young middle school kids coming up to me just to ask me questions or just to tell me about their own stories. And one of the kids, I don't even remember the question he asked, but it was probably like one of the deepest questions that I had gotten. And I remember my teacher saying to me afterward, or my former teacher rather, saying to me afterward, he never speaks up. He never asks questions. Like, he's kind of like the class clown. He's always in the back of the class. So he was like, so you clearly made a difference there. And I was like, and that's what I'm all about. Like, that's what I want. So and I think that made a big impact on me to know, even this volatile age group, they do want to hear about this stuff, and they do question it. And it makes me think that this is something that they probably think about and wonder about. And yeah,
no, absolutely. It's more of a reality check and a far cry from all the shows that they're constantly consuming, either consciously or subconsciously.
Yeah, absolutely.
Now, who do you think is your, or whom do you consider your best, truest critic?
I would have to say that would probably be my best friend, Nicole. So Nicole went to school and she majored in English, and then she got her master's degree in teaching English as a second language. So she is now a college professor. She works with a lot of foreign exchange students. And when she was getting her bachelor's degree, she worked as a writing tutor at the writing center at the college that we went to. And so she was one of the first ones to read my book. And what's great about her is that she's very good at like putting her feelings aside and just being able to look at what is being put in front of her and being able to look at it very objectively as opposed to subjectively. And that ended up being really helpful because she was able to give really credible feedback and honest feedback, and I think that made a big difference in the quality of my writing as well, because she was, she was truthful in saying, like, I think that you can cut this out, this is too wordy, or I think you need to expand on this a little bit more. So I would say she probably is my best critic, because she's a good mix of giving really good critiques that don't completely bring me down, but also overall improve the quality of the writing without totally changing the story. So that's probably who I would say.
That's lovely. Now, what are the kind of books and who are your favorite authors that you actually grew up with or grew up reading rather?
Yeah. So definitely, like, growing up, I read all of the Harry Potter books. That was a really big thing for me. And then I've read, like, so many books throughout my life, so I feel like it's hard for me to think back to, like, the authors that I grew up with, because there were so many of them. I think when I got to high school, we started reading more books that really got you thinking. Like, one of the books that we read was, like, The 5 People You Meet in Heaven by Mitch Albom, and now he's one of my favorite authors, so I read all of his books. So that's somebody that I kind of grew up reading. I got really into dystopian fiction, and that actually came from high school too, because we had to read Fahrenheit 451 by Ray Bradbury. So that became really big for me. And I think it's changed over time. Like, I remember, like, when I was younger, I was more into, like, fantasy. And then as I got older, it sort of morphed into books that make you think. And now it's sort of more a mix of books that make me think and psychological thrillers and mysteries and things like that. So it's constantly evolving and changing.
Right. What are you reading currently?
So right now I'm reading Before Now Again by Elizabeth Wetzel. She was a journalist, and she actually died probably about 10 years ago now from breast cancer, but she actually struggled with addiction throughout a good portion of her life. So this is her memoir. So I read her first book, Prozac Nation, that talked about kind of like her early years, formative years, kind of how she got into becoming an addict. And then this one is sort of a memoir from her life, from adulthood onward. So it talks about, like, different times that she struggled with drugs, and then also has struggled with bipolar disorder. So I'm reading that right now. And then I'm also reading this book called Transcending Trauma by Frank G. Anderson, and he does a lot of work with trauma victims, which is who I primarily do my work with in my field. So it's a book about different therapeutic approaches to work with this vulnerable population. So I just started this year reading more than one book at a time, so I juggle between more than one. So I'm always reading. So those are my books that I'm into right now.
Very interesting actually. Now, besides reading and writing, I gather that your interests in this is really, really interesting. Range from kickboxing, yoga, and dancing. That's quite a diverse range, right?
Yeah.
Expending energy to being very invigorating yourself. So, if you had to rate, well, what would be the order? Kickboxing, dancing, and yoga.
So I would, this is a tough one too. I think dancing would definitely be number one for me, because I just have always loved being able to move and tell story through dance. It's almost kind of like, an expansion of my writing life a little bit. And then after that, I would have to go with kickboxing, because I really like the adrenaline rush that you get from kickboxing, and it's another thing that helps me to feel very strong. I always feel great afterward. And then I'd have to say yoga would be last. Not that I don't like it any less, but I don't get the same adrenaline rush that I get from the kickboxing. So that's probably why I would rate it last. But I definitely try to practice it still on a regular basis.
Lovely. So probably a kickboxing session is followed by yoga to.
Exactly, yeah. Exactly, yep. It helps me calm down. Yep, I do my stretching so I don't have tight muscles. Yep. Can go hand in hand.
All right. Now,
Okay.
yeah, what is that one unique experience you've had ever since the pandemic? One that has probably impacted your writing as well.
Yeah, that's a good question too. I think probably like one of the most unique experiences that I probably went through during the pandemic was before I was an outpatient therapist, I actually was a medical social worker. So I worked at a local hospital. Um, so we were kind of at the forefront of when COVID-19 hit. And, I can remember sitting at lunch one day with like some of my work colleagues, and there were kind of whisperings about, this COVID-19 virus going around, and, nobody here is really talking about it. And, some of my colleagues were trying to figure out like, what is this going to look like? Why isn't anybody talking about this? What is our role going to be like? And then it hit, and then, it was sort of like I remember being at my desk and getting the news alert saying COVID-19 has been declared a pandemic. And I felt like with that being released, I almost felt like everybody in the hospital got that same news alert at the same time I did, because you could feel this shift in energy from it. And so much scrambling with like trying to get PPE, asking for donations, asking for people to sew masks, and just trying to then also find creative ways to still serve this population while also protecting our own health. Like, part of my role was to go into patients' rooms if they needed support or if they needed resources, and then all of a sudden it was like, you can't do that anymore. And trying to figure that out, and what type of protection are we going to have, and are we going to work on site or off site, and can we work remotely, and all of that, I think had a really big impact. And then of course when it hit, I was also in the process of leaving my job, so that was another unique experience, because I remember having conversations with my current bosses now about like, we don't know what this is going to look like, we still want to hire you, but right now like we're not really bringing people on because we're still trying to figure out how we're going to do everything remotely. So I was supposed to start my new job, I think, end of May, and I did not end up actually starting until end of July because there was just so much uncertainty. So that was kind of interesting to be navigating all of that. And at this new job that I work, I pretty much have been all telehealth this entire time. So that's kind of unique too, because I have never had the experience of working at this agency and seeing people face to face and doing therapeutic work face to face. And we're starting to talk about opening ourselves back up in July to see people in person. And I keep on thinking that's going to be the weirdest thing for me, because that hasn't been my experience up until now.
Right.
So a lot of unique experiences, but yeah, I think being in the healthcare field around the center of that and trying to navigate starting a new job as well was probably one of the more unique experiences I've had.
I'm sure, and particularly this has been a year which has actually given us multiple such first-hand and first-time experiences, I think.
Yeah, absolutely.
Right. So, any special message for viewers of the Writer Talks?
I would say, a special message that I would like to share is to just never give up on your dreams, which I know probably sounds really cheesy, but I know for me, I have learned from my experience with publishing good enough that no matter how scary something is, if you truly believe that it can make an impact or that it is worthwhile for you to pursue, then it means that there definitely is a reason that you're feeling that way. And it's most likely because whether it's sharing your story, whether it's, I don't know, going and pursuing your passion of dancing, or whatever it might be, if you're really drawn to it and it keeps on kind of niggling at you in the back of your brain, then it's something that you're meant to pursue. And so don't be afraid to listen to your gut instinct and whatever your heart is telling you that you need to do, because it's definitely worthwhile.
Absolutely, I completely agree with you that inner voice which keeps egging you on to pursue something. I think that needs to be given a chance. That needs to be heard. Such a vital message. Thank you so much for being on the Writer Talks, and all the best with Sign with Love coming up in 2022, and hope to see you back on the Writer Talks soon.
Yeah, absolutely. I'd love to be back. It was great being here.
Thank you for your time. Bye. Ahoy.
Thank you. All right, bye.